the fact is that if you can go to the next slide, please. The fact is that we are in the middle of a revolution. And there are four major trends that I would identify as defining the revolution that we find ourselves in today. The first is the cloud technology, the cloud computing technology that we have really developed in only the last few years. It is now the case that everything that we need, everything that we use, is accessible everywhere, from anywhere, at all times. Information no longer has to be transferred. It's no longer resident somewhere and then has to be transferred to the next place where it gets used. And that's a huge change in how information works within our lives professionally and so forth. The second major trend is the social media, the vast new social communities that are being created all over the place. This is a case where we moved from a world of business to business and business to consumer kinds of interactions to the place now where consumers are interacting with each other. So we have B2B, B2C, and now C to C and C back to B. So we all as consumers and as people in these communities are interacting with ourselves, with each other, with companies and producers in a whole new way, creating massive new channels for the information to move around. Thirdly, we're now in a world, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we are hyper-connected at all times of every day, from the cradle to the grave. In fact, I don't think it's an argument, an exaggeration to say that we're actually connected before that. People who are born in the last few years and from now on actually have a digital presence before they even have a physical presence. So the fact is that, and we all know that everything we have written on our Facebook pages and tweeted and so forth will outlive us by many years. So that information chain, that information connectivity is really vast and extensive. And finally, from our perspective, one of the most important trends that is working into this revolution is that we now have what you could call usable machine translation. You know, machine translation, it was said, since 1952, is 5 years away from perfection, and it always will be. But the fact is that in the last, I would say, 5-7 years or so, we've seen remarkable advances in machine translation to the point where we can actually consider it being usable for many applications that we would not have thought of before. So all of those trends come together to form this revolutionary environment that we find ourselves in. And what that means is that, if you go to the next slide, we're literally looking at an explosion of content around the world. We are in a place where every single minute of every day, there are 48 hours of new YouTube video. There are 204 million emails being written, 684,000 posts on Facebook, 500, almost 600 new websites being created every single minute of every day. That is an explosion that has taken off again in the last few years as a result of some of those trends. And the fact is that the content that is in all of that, the information, the words, the text, the pictures, the video, and so forth, are in everything, and they're everywhere that we are as humans. So we moved from a world where we sort of had this information kind of sequestered away on a desktop, but now we're in the mobile world. We're in the rich media world where audio, video, and so forth have become the mainstream. Speech is a huge area that's being developed, and I'm sure many of you know this already. Tactile, interactive. The information isn't just static anymore. It's in a place where it's becoming part of everything we do all the time and in every device and in every interaction that we engage in. And just in the same way, we've moved from a world where sort of the content that we talked about in the professional sense was sort of limited to the business community. It was kind of a business thing. You know, businesses would talk about content, or maybe media would talk about content. But now it's absolutely in everything. The social media obviously are huge. The communities that we've talked about, education is a vast amount of content that is now being transformed, as you know. Gaming and gamification of all kinds of different areas. News gathering, I mean, everybody out there with a smartphone is now a journalist and a photographer. And this information kind of explosion has spread out horizontally, so it's multimodal and it's multi-platform. And most maybe germane for us here in this room, most of that content isn't in English. The fact is that while English may be the single most representative language in some of these media, for example, you see here in Twitter, that English, you can't see it very well, but English is 34% of the tweets that go out. But that means that 66% of the tweets that go out are not in English. 2/3 of the world is tweeting in more languages, and that trend is continuing. In fact, with Twitter, and this relates to the next point, the fastest growing language is Arabic. Arabic has grown enormously. I'm sure you can imagine why, due to some of the events that were happening with Arab Spring and in Egypt and so forth. But you look at the web in general and you see that the fastest growing languages are not English. They are Arabic, Russian, and Chinese in that order. English constitutes less than 27% of the web at this point, and that number is going down steadily. I don't think that number will ever climb again. So what we're seeing is that all of this information is empowering the communities and the people out there to start using this technology and using this revolution for their own ends. And of course, you know that the web is growing exponentially. 2.5 billion users now on the web, half of them are in Asia. And the other kinds of areas where the web is being tracked, North America, Europe, and so forth, are growing slowly, but very, very slowly. Those other areas are growing absolutely tremendously fast. And so what that means is this content explosion hasn't actually just occurred here sort of in our obvious locales, but is in fact much more pronounced and much more prominent out there in the rest of the world, and it's enabling the rest of the world to grow very quickly. Now, when we talk about language, I think of it in a similar way to discussions about other kinds of infrastructural elements. If you think of electricity or energy or telecommunications or things like this, these require big infrastructures. But the biggest problem that those kinds of areas experience is what they call the last mile. So in other words, how do we get this thing that everybody needs to the very last house, the very last user, the very end of the street, so that those people can take advantage? And in the same way, I think it's useful to think of language as the last inch. You know, we have this tremendous technology that encompasses all of the things I've just been talking about, and it has an interface that exists in a set of languages. If that interface doesn't have those languages, it doesn't exist. That content is gone. That product does not exist, is not usable, and therefore has failed. So essentially, what language has become is the last and most important connector between all of these conversations, all of these products, all of these markets, all of these customers and consumers, and each other. If that language isn't there, none of that is happening. And so the metaphor I think that I came up with here is to talk about language in terms of oil. If you think of oil in the 20th century, oil was the thing that enabled everything to happen. It was the thing that basically it lubricated the machinery of that age. Well, language is the lubricant of the information age. It is what makes all of that exchange, interchange, interactivity, and connectivity work. And in every single area you can think of, there is not a single area of human endeavor that doesn't require this, that isn't at dare I say, at the mercy of language. The language is the crux of making all of these things happen: commerce, diplomacy, social engagements, entertainment, everything you can think of. And it is now, because of all of these things, become, I think, hyper obvious. I've been in the language business a long time, studied over 30 years ago in college. And language was the thing sort of that you did when you couldn't think of anything else. But now I think we've come into a world where it's become super evident that language is the most important piece of all of these engagements. So, I'd like us to think in terms of that. To me, it's a very positive message. I think it's super enabling and super stimulating. And if I had felt this kind of I think impetus when I was a student, who knows? I might have not had to spend so much time overcoming obstacles to actually engaging in the language business, which everyone around me tried to talk me out of. So what sits at the core of this, what sits at the nexus of this most important factor, is the language industry that I represent. We are the companies and individuals and organizations that engage in translation, localization, internationalization, globalization, all of these kinds of things, and more types of things that we never dreamt possible, things like speech translation, which is not the same as interpreting, content analytics. We're looking at data mining, analysis, content curation. These are all kinds of things that this powerful oil of language allows companies and individuals and customers and producers to engage in. And so the industry itself that I represent is, I think, one of a secret hidden in plain sight. We're a tremendously large business, pushing on $40 billion US dollars a year, 15 plus billion in the United States alone, probably at least 500,000 jobs in the language business. I'm talking about the language industry now. And think about what that enables, that 15 billion plus of work that these people do enables $1.5 trillion of US exports. It's an amazing story that we need to be telling more and more powerfully. That this is the oil that is going to allow all of that machinery to work and be successful. So today, languages are not, I would argue, going beyond the teaching and going beyond the sort of old perceptions of language. Today, languages have to be real time. There is no delay that is acceptable anymore. The languages must be in a real-time format. They have to be always on. Otherwise, all those things that we just looked at don't happen. They stop. So languages can't stop. They have to be everywhere. And they have to be accessible to everyone. In fact, did you go to the next slide? If you look at the sort of cutting edge of what's going on in language, real time isn't even good enough. We have to be able to interface with everything that's going on to actually be able to push language ahead of when real time occurs. We have to be on the trend of technologies where we can deliver content to people before they even ask for it, before they even know they need it. This is the kind of world we're living in the language industry. And one of the most important things I think that we are grappling with is the notion now of a locale of one. In the past, we talked about countries or regions or markets. But now we've hyper-personalized what we're doing down to the point where we have to be able to address, this guy on the left who was born in Lebanon, works for a company in France that's an American company, travels to Asia, and needs certain types of linguistic resources, certain types of content, certain types of access. this has to be done in a real-time, super fast way, and we're constantly adding languages, we're constantly adding types of markets and types of needs to this. So, you know, we all know this, but we need to get the message out that languages are no longer nice to have. They're not a nice garnish on something meatier on the plate. The fact is that they're hugely useful, of course, but they have become an entree unto themselves. They are the things that allow us to leverage global markets. How will these companies that we all know that are out there trying to push into more and more markets, how will they do that without language? They can't. They need the skills and the resources that the people who are coming out of institutions like BYU can provide so that they can in fact reach those customers, so they can expand their businesses and grow their markets. And in addition, they need a workforce that's globally talented. We've talked about some of that already here, and I'm really glad to hear that. The issue is that companies in the business world are dying for people who have skills that can allow them to move smoothly between cultures, between languages, between markets, that will allow these companies to actually grow and expand. There is a huge deficit of those skills out there in the marketplace right now. And Bill's absolutely right. We need to identify better what those are. We need to send those demand signals back more clearly and more specifically. But the point is the demand is huge. And I'll get to this point in a minute, and I mentioned some of this already. There is a huge business around language itself, localization, translation, that I've already talked about. That is a very big business that people who are studying these subjects need to know in and of themselves. But they also need to know that that's not all there is. You know, you don't have to be a translator if you get a degree in French. It's a wonderful thing to do, and you can have a fabulous career, and there's a lot of big business and a lot of interesting things to do. But there's also an enormous amount of value in bringing that to other parts of the workforce and other parts of the marketplace. So we need to start getting that message to these people that the only job they can have is not, strictly speaking, in language. So let me tell you about some of the challenges that I think that are ahead for us that we see from the perspective of the language industry. The first one is speed. I've talked about this a little already. We are in a huge crisis of how to deliver language content to everywhere that it's needed as fast as possible, and as I already said, faster than real time. There are massive infrastructures at play here, technology being developed, workflows, almost everything we know from the traditional way that language was done is being turned on its head. We have to figure out a way to integrate skilled linguists with machines, with big data, with analytics to be able to deliver the kinds of language resources that the world is demanding. So that is a huge issue. Another issue I talked about before is the global talent. We need people who have the skills in combination. This concept for us of Humanities Plus is a fantastic one, because the purely linguistic skills are a very narrow niche. We have a lot of need for much broader linguistic skills in the marketplace. There are jobs to be had that don't require a native fluency. There are jobs that in the business part of what we do. There are jobs in sales, there are jobs in project management, localization engineering, desktop publishing, web development, and so forth, where the language is a critical piece, but it's not the center piece necessarily. It might be very close to the center. So finding ways to develop those skills for ourselves, for our industry, and for the customers that we serve is a critical challenge ahead of us. And obviously, volume is a huge challenge that we face. with all that content that's being developed, with all of the conversations that are going on, that ultimately revolve all around you or me as an individual, there is a huge amount of data and content that has to be processed and that has to be dealt with. So we're constantly facing the challenge of how do we deal with that, and it's not just technology by itself that we have to focus on. And of course, new content and new media and new interfaces and new connectivity are entering all the time. So we really have to, as an industry and as a provider of this lubricant for the information age, we have to constantly be looking for ways to deal with this element. And there are opportunities. You know, we could talk endlessly just about the kinds of opportunities there are, but I would stress three of them. The obvious one, of course, is linguistic. You know, translation is a linguistic function and requires high skills in language. And so certainly there's a lot of potential for people to engage in very good careers in language as a strictly speaking focused activity. And the translation business that we represent is largely, of course, not the kind of translation that is, I was going to say taught, I'm not sure taught is even the right word, that is tangentially mentioned in language instruction in higher education, at least by my experience and from what I've seen. This is the kind of translation that I'm talking about in the last few minutes, the business world of translation, the content that needs to be multilingual. But there are vast amounts of opportunities there. The emerging market languages have an enormous potential for folks to develop huge careers in business. There's a very big need for entrepreneurial approaches, a very big opportunity for entrepreneurs in our business. This is the type of industry that has very low barriers to entry. You don't need to create massive technological infrastructures. You don't need to have capital investments. You can begin to do some of the things we're talking about with a very small kind of core investment. And when I was coming up through the school, I did not have the opportunity for anyone to tell me that sort of thing. At the same time, I was, I guess, naive enough to figure, well, I'll see what I can do, and I started my own business in the language industry. But the fact is that this is an enormous opportunity for people to combine business skills and entrepreneurial drive with linguistics and with technology as well. And that brings me to the third major opportunity, which is technological. You know, I've been saying it all along, but there are vast amounts of technology infrastructure that we're building for making these multilingual conversations happen. Machine translation engines, workflows, you know, analytics and so forth. So people who have engineering skills are not enough for us. We need people who have engineering and web development and other kinds of skills, but also have cultural awareness and language skills and can work and understand what it means to basically convert content from one culture to another. Much more important, especially as we talk about the social media and the kinds of personal interactions that, you know, 20 years ago didn't happen on that kind of scale. It was more business to business. Now we're talking about supporting consumers and individuals talking with each other around the world. And so culture plays a huge role here, and we need people who have the skills, and those who do can make a very good living and can develop, I think, a very strong career for themselves going forward. And some people say, well, isn't English going to become the language of the world? Absolutely not. You know, English is the sort of lingua franca as we go around and we interact on a level. There has to be something that we use. But the fact is, if you go 1 centimeter deeper into any kind of content, conversation, or topic, English immediately falls away. There is no way that these kinds of communities and markets and companies can communicate with English only. That is not going to be the case. And more languages are being added. So this is a perpetual a perpetual opportunity that will be here for a very long time. I will, while I'm at it, I'll also address a small point where people say, well, machine translation, should be the answer to our problems. I mean, we'll have the Star Trek communicators one of these days, and every so often the Guardian or the Economist or somebody trots out an article like this. And the fact is that, as I said, it's made great strides, but we're a very long way from machines being able to take over this function. And certainly machines haven't even begun to address the issue of culture and these kinds of nuances that they can't possibly address. So from our perspective, the opportunity is gigantic, and it's long-term, and it is very lucrative. So to close, I would say I have many thoughts and many desires and perhaps things that I would like to see us do, but let me mention three. We've got to find ways to connect the academy more with industry and business. It's got to be a two-way street, and it's got to be a loop that we can continuously keep open and feed back. There's a huge misperception on the part of, I think, academia about what industry is, what it needs, and what it does. And there's frankly probably a bias on the industry side as to what academia does and how it does it and how well it can do what it's doing. We need to find ways to lower that, and BYU is right there at the forefront of really making that happen. We need to do it to a much greater extent. And one of the things we think that will help us do that is holding a national conversation. I have a little self-promo selfie pic here of myself with Bill at the White House recently, but the point is we have got to make an effort to inject this topic, this information, this knowledge into the national conversation. There's far too much lack of knowledge and far too much of a lack of caring on the part of policymakers and others as to the importance of language and what we do. So, Bill and I started last year an initiative called the American Language Enterprise Advocacy. This is about pitching language in all its various forms, education, enterprise, industry, and so forth, to policymakers to make sure they understand what the importance is. We're working with the White House on some initiatives, for example, to connect language with STEM. I think it's a bit of a misrepresentation to consider language apart from STEM, or to try to sort of almost glom language onto STEM. In our view, from our industry perspective, language is a STEM. Language is something that's got to be included in that kind of high focus, high level, high intensity combination of technology and other kinds of skills and efforts. So we want to see language become part of this conversation and part of the focus on the administration side to as high as it is for STEM. And finally, one small thing that I'll share, this top one there, don't drive students away. And what I mean by that is, I think sometimes what happens in academia, and you'll forgive me if I'm overstating the case here, that there's the notion that students who want to study language, they either have to become teachers or they have to become translators or focus on the linguistic aspect of it in its very purest form. And I think we make a mistake when we drive students away who don't want to develop language skills to that degree. We need to make sure that they want to add language to what they're doing, that they want to add that skill set to something else that they're already interested in. And that way, we don't create a situation where it's you sort of have a bifurcation. You either have to choose to go into teaching or you have to drop it entirely and go do something else. I think sometimes that there's a false choice there that exists. I know that in my own case, back in the days when I was studying Russian with Charlie Townsend, I had said to him, I don't want to study literature. I mean, I like literature, but I don't want to major in literature. Then he said, well, then you'll have to become a teacher. I said, I don't want to teach Russian. I want to become a translator. And he said, well, you can't make a living at that. And at the time, of course, that was less of my focus. I was interested in the mechanics of language. So I actually convinced Charles Townsend, who, if some of you know him, this took some doing. I convinced him to let me do my senior thesis on the translation of Marina Tsvetaeva, but not in terms of literature, but in terms of the mechanics of language and translation. So it was an annotated translation. The point was I had to force my way into adapting how I wanted to do language to go against some of the norms. And I think that, I hope that's less the case now, but I think we still need to work on driving that further so that students can combine language easily and comfortably with what they're doing, and let those who want to focus on language continue to do that, of course, as much as they want.